the current current direction it has. I'm actually in the, I won't even say the middle yet, but I'm in the late early stages of writing a book about Detroit's tax foreclosure era. So from 1999 to the present day and whatever kind of happens next. And the book is really a synthesis of having spent like things I've learned, having spent way too much time around this issue. And by way too much time, I mean, there are so many things about how tax foreclosure has played out that any one of which you would think would have been like the alarm signal to elected leaders, people with power to say, we really need to go reform this thing. This is like not working well for people. It's legally questionable. The processes are all screwed up and it's having a terrible effect on people and property in the city. Any one of those things you would think like, okay, let's go open this thing back up. But somehow it has been able to continue trudging along like a juggernaut for almost 2 decades at this point and counting. And so it's a real mystery to me, why can something like that go on for this long without intervention? And so a lot of the lens that I've been looking at it through recently is trying to answer that question. If everybody knew that it was so messed up, why did it go on for so long? And the experience that I had that kind of like brought me into those insights, I run a property data and software company called Loveland Technologies. We have a website at landgrid.com. And starting back in 2009, 2010, we started mapping property information in Detroit. So this is like, you know, it's both not a long time ago, but also a long time ago, right? How quickly the world moves. And at that point in time, there really was no way to like find out property ownership or property boundaries or anything like that in a convenient fashion online. And so we basically recognized like, okay, Detroit's got like 400,000 parcels. People are really interested in who owns things. At the time, I knew that there was this tax foreclosure auction that happened every year where these, you know, $500 properties were, you know, all put online and people could go buy them and hopefully do fantastic things with them. And it was kind of an anomaly and it was interesting. It was like somebody should put this property information online so we know what's happening. And so my colleagues and I, you know, we weren't even a company at the time, it was just more of like a project, started to put this information online. And it attracted a really interesting cross-section of people because we were, you know, getting people from the government using the website because they didn't have access to this kind of information in a convenient fashion. We were getting real estate investors who you might expect, right? People who are interested in buying properties are like, oh, wow, I can see this stuff now. But then we were also getting what I would call advocates, activists, and researchers who were all interested in improving life, improving planning, just making the city a better place to live. And so we were kind of like confronted with all these different uses for this kind of information. And for a couple of years in there, we just sort of like mapped what properties were at the tax auction every year, but we didn't know anything about them, really. We just knew like, wow, there's 15,000 colorful splotches on the map this year. That's all the stuff that's for sale. But we were fortunate and privileged, I guess you would say, to be contacted by a task force assembled in Detroit during the city's bankruptcy in 2013. I'll keep this part of it short, but it's just interesting to think of the players that kind of like, you know, came through here. So there was this Blight task force. It was supported by the White House. So the Obama administration sent people to Detroit to help them through the bankruptcy. The idea, as I understood it, was they didn't want to do a financial bailout, so they didn't want to like help pay the debt, but they did want to like identify key areas that needed to be addressed and improved. And so they picked things like, you know, education, I think was one, like crime was one. And amongst the list of others, one of them was referred to as blight, okay? So this is just like problems in the landscape. So burned buildings, vacant buildings, dumping, things of that nature that the city needs to maintain, tear down, fix up, et cetera. And so we were approached because we'd been doing this digital mapping work. And so we were the local experts on that. And we got asked what we would do to help Detroit get on top of its blight problem. And so we proposed, which was pretty radical at the time, we were like, well, you know, since there's no data set that can like count how many vacant buildings there are, why don't we actually send people out to go visit every single parcel of property in the city, they can look at it, they can take pictures, and they can make notes on it. And then we can put it into the system where it can be updated over time. We can bring all sorts of data sets together. And so kind of incredibly, that got greenlit. It was a project called Motor City Mapping. And this was from end of 2013 into 2014. We helped to manage a team of 200 Detroiters that went out and they looked at all 350,000, 400,000 properties in the city, took the pictures, made the notes. Is it occupied? Is it not occupied? Is it open to trespass? Is it dilapidated? Does it look like it's in urgent need of demolition for safety reasons, fire damage, dumping, all this stuff, in addition to the nice stuff too, right? They'd also know when it was, open commercial business, good condition, nice house, whatever. And so as we got this real-time picture of the state of every parcel in the city, we started to bring in other data sets. And one of the data sets, it was the kind of the biggest aha moment, is when we brought in property tax delinquency, and when we brought in the foreclosure auction that was happening at the end of that year, and we layered it on top of this brand new in-person occupancy data that, as much as one can tell, gave you beyond a shadow of a doubt where people were living and where they weren't living. And to an overwhelming and atrocious degree, the occupied homes were overlapping with the tax foreclosure auction properties. And so this was it may sound silly now, this is like more obvious, but really in like 2013, 2014, there were a lot more questions about what was actually being taken through the foreclosure process and what was being auctioned. And so what we saw coming was like this time bomb of like, you were about to sell all these occupied homes out from under these people. And at the same time, the big reason why you're even doing this project to learn is to do something about all the vacant houses in the city so that there aren't as many vacant houses around the landscape. And so it just strikes us, it seems kind of obvious that like, if you want to reduce the vacancies, you probably shouldn't be auctioning the occupied homes, right? And then further from the observations in the data, it was something like a 90% correlation with vacant properties and properties that had been through the tax auction. Okay, so there was at least a massive correlation. There were questions, I'm sure in some cases they went to the auction because they were vacant, but in other cases they were vacant because they went through the auction. And so this seemed like a really big insight, right? This is like something, okay, if we want to cut off the blight pipeline, we can actually do tax foreclosure reforms where like at a minimum, let's not sell occupied homes to the highest bidder, right? This all seemed like it made a lot of sense. But the experience that I had and have witnessed since then is that sort of remarkably, even though it seems to go against like every stated goal of the city and local government, this process of taking and selling people's houses really has not changed very much. And in those last 5 or 6 years, it has, if the city's torn down, 25,000 houses since then, it's hard to get exact numbers, but I would say at least more than half of that have gone newly vacant, in large part driven by this tax foreclosure phenomenon. And I can tell you, as somebody who tried to work on some reforms directly with local government, so like trying to work with the mayor's office, trying to work with the county treasurer, there were like little fleeting like moments where it was like, okay, let's get on the same page and like earnestly address this. But the dominant theme was really one of like resistance and like, let's not look at this and like stop highlighting these things and let's stop showing people what's actually happening here. And this whole notion of trying to like clarify the situation was seen as meddling. And it was very, very confusing. It was, and I'm sure, I'm not sure if you guys have experienced this sort of situation yet in your life. If you haven't yet, I'm guessing you totally will, because it's just part of the way the world works. When you're seeing something like so clearly happening that is wrong, but for whatever reason, like the people that you're working with or who have more power or who are responsible for it are just sort of like, just stop. And you have to kind of make a choice for yourself, like which direction you're going to go at that point. Do you kind of pull back and say, you're right, forget it. Let's do a different kind of mapping here and we'll ignore that. And in our case, we couldn't really ignore it. So at some point we stopped like working officially with local governments, not because we had any problem with doing that, but just because the work looking at tax foreclosure was not really welcomed or invited and encouraged. it took a long time, but I got, this is probably on the 2016, 2017 timeline, got my first real like aha moment for like, why are people being so protective about continuing with this arrangement or this situation? And the aha moment probably shouldn't be a surprising one, right? Because they always say like, follow the money, like see what's going on with the money. And it's usually true, not always true, but it's usually true. And this was a case where at that time, I was very surprised to find, because you would think that if people are not paying their taxes, that would mean like the local government is not getting paid, right? Like if you're not paying your taxes, if people aren't paying taxes, it would make sense that there just wouldn't be, that money would not be collected. But surprisingly, and I think as like a key motivator of why this whole situation has rolled on, is that a part of Michigan's tax foreclosure law includes a pretty novel financial arrangement that involves the city and the county and the bond market in how money is borrowed to cover delinquent taxes, and then how penalties, interest, and fees are put onto that money that's borrowed, and then how ultimately at the end of it, there's this auction where the county could keep the profits from the sale. I don't know if you guys can nod to let me know, but did you guys talk at all yet about the Michigan Supreme Court case that just had their ruling? There was a case, not to digress, but just literally like 2 months ago, the Michigan Supreme Court found that it was unconstitutional. And when I say unconstitutional, I don't just mean against the state constitution, but against the older one, the U.S. Constitution, that counties in Michigan cannot keep profits from auction sales, meaning that if they take a house that owed $1,000 and they sell it for $20,000, they need to return $19,000 to the prior owner. Until just recently, that's what they were doing. They were taking the profit beyond what debt was actually owed, and the former owner had no equity or nothing that was considered owed to them at all. And so the way that the tax debt financial system works in Michigan, and this is came up alongside of our current law, which again was 1999. We started this fast track tax foreclosure law. The city will assess the current year's taxes, and then for that year, it'll try to go collect the money from property owners. So for 1 year, Detroit tries to collect its own property tax payments. When that year is over, they look at whatever is uncollected. So the debt, the missing piece, let's say they come up $200 million short. Rather than still trying to collect it, they transfer that debt to the county. And the county then goes out to the bond market and it borrows $200 million. And they buy these things, they're called DTANs, Delinquent Tax Anticipation Notes. And I've actually tried to buy some because I became that kind of a nerd just to see how it works. They definitely don't want to sell it to people who don't want to buy, hundreds of thousands of dollars. But they sell this note. The county then takes the money and it makes the city whole. So you've got to think in the short term, what does that mean? It means that Detroit doesn't really care whether people pay their taxes or not. It means whatever they assess the land value at, they're guaranteed a check for that amount of money. So particularly towards the beginning of the system, it was just like, this is like a miracle, right? We don't even need to invest in collection right now. We just get paid, and we get paid whatever we assess things at. Meaning if something was over-assessed or it was too much, more than somebody was going to pay for it, they'd still get that check. Then the county becomes that debt collector looking for the $200 million. They put 18% interest on top of it. There's various penalties and fees, things of that nature. And the way that it works out in Detroit is that we almost have a culture of paying your taxes late. I think most people don't even think about paying their taxes on time to the city. They're like, whatever, I'll pay them when they get to the county. And that means more than a third of the city, probably about half of the city, is writing their property tax check late with some amount of interest, some amount of penalties to the county. And when everything is said and done at the end of the whole dance on this 3-year cycle, the county comes out tens of millions of dollars ahead every year, more than they would have made if people had just paid their taxes on time. And there's a second magic trick to this too, which is if you just collect taxes those dollars need to go to something very specific, right? People, whatever you do, you assess mills, they go to the school or the library or the community college or whatever it is. But if you get the interest and the penalty payments and all those things, it's actually tens of millions of dollars every year that you can spend on whatever you want. So you can use it to cover like gaps in payroll. You can put it into the general fund. You can buy snow plows and stuff with it, you know, which is one of the things I've seen discussed. Commissioners getting excited they can take this money and buy a snow plow. And so behind all of this like despair and stress and the treadmill to pay this money is actually fantastically profitable for the county in the short term. And when you look at the numbers and you think about the financial situations that both the city and the county are in, neither of which is great, right? I mean, Detroit had its bankruptcy fairly recently, 5 years ago now it came out of bankruptcy. Wayne County was like an inch away from emergency management, which in Michigan terms, and what had been happening at the time was like, you know, your precursor step to bankruptcy. And it's well documented that the only reason that they avoided emergency management was they took hundreds of millions of dollars, which had built up in this delinquent tax fund, and they just put it in the general fund. And they said, okay, like we're financially better right now. And since that time, they've continued to rely on transferring. I think the most recent numbers, it's between 20 and $30 million every year from late taxes and auction profits into the general fund. And so, you know, you think about this, so like right there, like you get that realization, right? And you're like, okay, like it's totally messed up, but you at least see why there would be some pressures from certain levels of government to perpetuate something like this. Because you're on the one hand, you're looking at it like it's blood money, which is actually a direct quote from our county executive, Warren Evans, called it blood money and said that anybody who would perpetuate the current system to keep that status quo and get those dollars, you know, shouldn't be in government. But then at the same time, that system has continued, and there's continued to be reliance on the late payments and the interest and the auction sales. Now, conversely, you're just kind of like looking for like motives and like why have things, you know, lasted this long. There's different dynamics between the city and the county. So if the county makes a lot more of its revenue from property taxes, so it's a very important revenue stream to the county, and that interest is very important. Meanwhile, on the other hand, I don't think most people would expect this because property taxes are typically like top two and often number one revenue source for a municipality. Detroit relies very, very little on property taxes. I think the current numbers are something like, it's like 2.5% of the city's budget comes from residential property taxes. So I'm not going to say that's nothing. It's a big budget for a city, right? But you think about in your own life trying to budget differently for like 2% of your income, and you're like, it's not like it's you know, 10 or 20, let alone like 40 or 50% like it can be. And part of the reason for that, as I understand it, is that, you know, for years Detroit has had a diminishing population and a concurrent you know, diminishment of the property tax base. And so there were some moves made to try to fill in those revenue gaps, and notably like the casinos were a part of this, right? Like we have 3 casinos in the city, which have been devastated by COVID, so I'm not sure how any of this is going to play out. But that started to like fit in for what typically would have been residential property tax. And from talking to people who managed the bankruptcy, negotiated, were working in like the CFO's office for the city, it was remarkable to me that a city could go through financial bankruptcy, municipal bankruptcy, and at the same time it could have all of these residents that had debt, essentially like to the city and also the county. And somehow that debt was never addressed. So there was nothing that provided any relief for that in the bankruptcy whatsoever. In fact, tax foreclosures spiked insanely during the bankruptcy. They went to their biggest years. It was like 25,000 tax foreclosures at auction in 2013 and 2014. So the explanation that I've received is that, strangely, like when people sat down and actually looked at the books for like where could they get money in the city and what needs to be reset, residential property taxes were just not on the radar. They were like not something that was important enough to look at, which is had tremendously devastating impacts and will continue to do for a long time. If you just think there are 3 major goals that were put forward by the city, by the current administration. They have some more goals than this, but these are like three like super main ones that you'll see repeated forever. And that's to grow the city's population. And Detroit's been losing population since its peak in 1950. So one goal was to not just slow that down, but to actually grow the population, eliminate all blight in the city. So no more being synonymous with vacant houses and derelict buildings and things like that. And then to build a city that's truly inclusive, both racially and in income. So this motto of, you know, one city for all of us. And these have been like main goals that you see repeated. I don't know if you guys have followed, but Detroit has spent close to $400 million in demolition funds over the last 5 years or so. It's the largest demolition program in the country. They've been tearing down just thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of houses. And against all these stated goals, again, this is another mystery. How can something go on this long when it works against all of these goals that are like marquee goals? Because the tax foreclosure process has reduced the population. It's tough to tell to what degree exactly, but it's certainly displaced people, made places less attractive to live. It's created more vacant buildings, more vacant properties, more vacant spaces. And it has built an environment that's really not very inclusive at all, because it preys on people who are poorer and have lower valued homes, have a hard time being a homeowner and staying inside of the city. And so, you know, kind of taking that as like background, that you have like a devastating process which has reshaped where people live. It's reshaped who owns the city. Detroit in that time period moved from a majority owner city to a majority renter city. And as you all know or can imagine, it's people who don't actually own their property in a city who often have the hardest times and are most resistant to changes happening in the city, because you don't really have a stake, you don't have that equity, you don't have the wealth, and you don't have the control over where you live. And so if new things move in or new people move in, you become more susceptible to rent increases, all your life can be destabilized, all of that. And so Detroit tax foreclosure has built this sort of like perfectly imperfect game board of who actually owns the city right now. It's no longer majority, you know, homeowner people who live here. And so you look at all these things as kind of a background, and then you think about like, okay, so what were we actually trying to do with this law? Like, what was the point of this law to begin with? And the law has a really interesting backstory, and I was able to get a little more insight and sort of a surprising venue for it. Just last fall, I was at a big semi-annual vacant property conference. It's like there is such a thing, right? It's every 18 months, folks get together for an event called Reclaiming Vacant Properties. It was in Atlanta last fall, and it's basically folks from government, community groups, funders from all over America talking about what to do with vacant and foreclosed properties in their communities. And I want to tell this story with all due respect, because I really do admire the work of the person who I'm about to like repeat part of the story for. But we have a congressman in Michigan named Dan Kildee, who is from the Flint area, Genesee County area, and has been a real force for creating land banks and innovative programs for doing things with problem properties. And he told the story at this event. This was like, you know, a gala dinner, chicken dinner kind of a thing. That and the organizing group was sort of like, you know, being nostalgic and kind of talking about like, how did we get here? Like, what were the influences? And Dan told the story about how when he was the treasurer of Genesee County, which is the county that Flint, Michigan is in, that they recognized that there was a problem in Michigan, that there were abandoned properties, that owners were figuring out how to game the system. They weren't paying property taxes. There was not a foreclosure auction system. There was a tax lien system, which basically meant, you know, if you don't pay your taxes, the city doesn't get paid, but third-party investors can show up, pay the taxes, put a lien on the property, the city gets some money, and then over a course of years, that investor might sue the owner to the point where they got control of the property. So moral of the story, it was a long multi-year foreclosure process. Somebody could have an abandoned property that could stay in a community for 5, 6, 7 years or longer because it was complicated to get that property back. And so what was being celebrated was this whole notion that this law had been created in Michigan to solve the problem that all these abandoned properties were just sitting there forever. So what was the solution? The solution was dramatically speed up the time to tax foreclosure. So moving from a 5, 6, 7-year process to a strict 3-year process, where at the end of that 3rd year, you just lose your stuff. That's it, you're done. And then as a part of that process, this innovative financial component where the counties could keep the profits from the auction sales, and they could then use that money to get to work on these problem properties. So like really well-intentioned, like the thoughts that I heard expressed were like, don't let people sit on abandoned properties, get them back to productive use real fast, sell them to people who are going to use them, and then use any profit that you make from that process and actually like put that back into the properties. And now you've got sort of an equation that kind of makes sense for like how you could actually eradicate abandonment, right? And so what that showed to me is there's this massive irony at the heart of this entire situation, which is that the reason that the law was put into place in 1999 was to do almost exactly the opposite of how it's played out, at least in certain communities, okay? Michigan's a big state. Detroit is anomalous, you know, in many ways, right? We've got, it's the industrial seat of not just Michigan, but like, you know, many parts of the country. And if you think that Detroit used to have 2 million people in it, the state of Michigan only has 10 million people right now, right? So it's a significant part of the population. But if you look at where the tax foreclosures, how they play out across the state, Detroit currently only has 7% of Michigan's population, okay? And it's a demographic inverse too. So Detroit is about 80% Black, 20%, I'll just put it into a big basket, right? Like white, Latino, Asian, others, but 80% Black. And Michigan itself is sort of the opposite. It's like 80% white, and then like the basket, you know, the other 20% is the basket. And so with those demographics, Detroit has 7% of the population, but over the long majority of tax foreclosure, it had 2/3 of all the tax foreclosures in the state happened in the city. And I don't have as granular of data for other counties, because I'll only have the data for the counties and not which particular communities. But if I had to guess, and this is something that should be figured out, it's really the Black and the brown communities that are having the foreclosure process happen to them at this scale. In fact, our treasurer, county treasurer, Eric Sabri, was just interviewed on a podcast, and you know, he's like sort of like adopted this new like more woke stance about the situation in his words and his framing, and he was opining. He's like, no, it's been crazy since I've been in office. He's like, Detroit has 80% of Wayne County's tax foreclosures, but when you look at it further and you look at the other majority minority communities in Wayne County, it's actually 90% of all of our tax foreclosures happen in those communities. Like, gee, isn't that like weird? It's like kind of crazy. And so whatever the intentions are behind it, I mean, if you were looking for an example of structural racism, people are like, what's that? Like, I don't know what that kind of concept means. You know what that concept means? But where you have a law that is applied equally over the space of an entire state, and then you watch where it has the most disastrous consequences, and then that correlates to race and demographics, tax foreclosure has got to be like your poster child for that. One of them, right? It's got to at least tie. It's just insane how much this burden has fallen onto communities of color in Michigan, mostly Detroit, but also other communities of color in Michigan. So all this sort of like, you know, begs a question, you know, it's like, so if this stuff has gone on for so long and has been so stressful to people and so destructive, and it has reshuffled the playing board of game ownership in Detroit so heavily to landlords and to speculative ownership, what in the world is going to happen now? And now we're at a really interesting time right now. I mean, granted, we're, you know, 10 or 20 years into this horrible process, depending on if you want to count from, 2008 onward or from the beginning. But we are in a pandemic right now, obviously, right? Hence the Zoom meetings. The tax foreclosures have been canceled this year in Detroit. So the treasurer was like, yeah, we're just not going to do it this year, right? Which is sort of like an amazing display of like waving a magic wand that was always kind of there if they wanted to use it, but that they had not chosen to use yet. And we have the situation where the Michigan Supreme Court recently ruled that it is unconstitutional for a county to keep the profit from these auction sales. Now, at the same time, preliminary data from what we can see, and this is probably not surprising, with COVID and the pandemic, and probably some of the lack of like, okay, I'm not going to get foreclosed this year. Okay, let me think about what needs to be paid for. Tax debts and properties subject to foreclosure are up again this year, and we don't know how high they're going to stay up, but it means that there's a ballooning of this tax delinquency. And I probably should have mentioned this part earlier too. This is a, hopefully I'm doing okay. This is like a tough story to like keep the threads without.
We have about 2 more minutes.
Okay.
To make sure we have time to spend.
Okay. And then it'll be good for me to shut up, and because I want to like start to get in. There's obviously a lot to talk through here, but the one fascinating thing to be aware of and to watch, and it's been kind of confounding for those of us who are like trying to get reforms to happen here, is that over the last 4 years, there have been a reduction in the number of properties in the tax auction. So basically it was like, we had a peak auction years, 2014, 2015, we had 25,000 properties at auction. And then the following years, they seemed to go down by about half each year. So it was like 25, and then 12, and then 6, and then 3, and then it's kind of stayed at 3. And what's been happening is that the county government can then go, and the city too, can point at that graph and say like, look, we're solving this problem. Isn't this wonderful? Like, look, these are huge reductions. The numbers are still too high, but like, look, half, boom, 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 boom. And when you look behind the scenes at what they're doing, this is frustrating, because it's this thing where you need to like celebrate. Okay, that's good. Let's get fewer of those occupied homes in there. But if you look at the tax delinquency behind the scenes, the tax delinquency is not going down, and now it's going back up. Right? It's been pretty static. It's maybe gone down a little bit at times. So behind the scene, think back to this financial incentive I mentioned earlier. Most of those tens of millions of dollars every year are coming from those late taxpayers. They're not really coming from the auction sales. So there's sort of a recognition that like, we don't even really need to do the auction anymore. And now the Supreme Court's made that abundantly clear. They can't they can do the auction. There's no financial benefit to doing it. But all of the interest and the penalties from the people paying late, nobody even really watches that. They just want to see auction number go down. And so in the background of this, we don't have less tax debt, less tax delinquency. We just have a lot of people who are in a really big hole, and the county siphoning off a lot of interest from that hole. So with COVID, with the ballooning of the debt, with the Supreme Court decision, what would appear to be coming imminently, I don't know dates, sometime within the next year, it would seem this would have to be addressed, is there needs to be something of like a constitutional convention in Michigan to go look at the tax foreclosure law, now that it is unconstitutional to profit from the auction sales, and say, okay, like, how are we going to change this thing? And then that creates this really critical moment for people who've been paying attention, and people who have better ideas, and people who are advocates to participate in that and say, okay, this is actually the moment where we're not going to do this the same way moving forward. And in fact, we're also going to address some of the structural things which have, nobody here is evil, but those dollar amounts have led everybody to continue to do the same kind of squeeze year over year. So we also need to address some of the revenue issues that are happening around Wayne County. So,
thank you, Jerry.
Yeah, so that's a good time for me to.
Yeah. All right, so Sonja, you are up next. Are you here?
Sorry, yes, I am.
Hello. All right. Well, we have her bio in the chat. It's important to, again, have all of the numbers and the context around property tax foreclosure, but it's even more important to understand the lived experience. And so Sonja, the floor is yours.
Hi all, my name is Sonja Bonnett. I am a proud member of the coalition. I have been a member since its start. And so I'll start with how I got into this particular work, and then I'll end with what I'm doing now. So around 2009, 2011, bear with me on the dates because it was a long time ago and it's still a very tough issue for me. But I got a letter or a door hanger saying that my house was in foreclosure. The crazy part about that is I was doing a land contract to buy my home, and the taxes were in the amount that I paid every month. So I shouldn't have had delinquent taxes. Also, no letters or anything prior had came to the house. So it was like a bomb. So I first reached out to the people I was buying the house from and, inquired what's going on. We engaged into an argument, and about a week later, I got a quick deed in the mail. So great, now it's my house all the way, but also my tax debt, which was $5,000, and I didn't have $500, let alone $5,000. And so at that point, I reached out to every organization and event that was going on to help people who were going through foreclosure. I went to what's called, I'm sorry, I'm losing. First, I went to the United Community Housing Coalition, which is an organization that usually helps with housing, to see if they could help me. Because my situation was unique in the fact that I was buying the house on land contract, and then the house was deeded to me. The way that works is the taxes that were acquired prior to the house being put in my name were not, they were taxes that I couldn't have gone on to a payment plan, or long story short, there was no help for me. So I was kind of stuck in this situation where I was kind of just waiting on the sheriffs or whoever was coming to knock on the door and put me, my children, and my husband out of our home, because we knew that the house was going to go up for the auction that Jerry was talking about that happens every fall. So from reaching out to the United Community Housing Coalition, Professor Atuahene had got my name and information, and she called me to do an interview about a study she was doing. And in that phone call, I learned what was really happening. Number one, I was eligible for a program called the Poverty Tax Exemption, which basically says if you make under the federal poverty line, if your income is under the federal poverty line, then you're eligible for either reduced taxes or no taxes at all on your home. Also, she had informed me in this short phone call about all of the illegal foreclosures going on. And with that phone call, I guess I got kind of activated and pissed, really, really pissed off. Because what was happening to me was not only, morally wrong, but it was illegal and against Michigan's constitution, because Michigan has its own constitution, which says that they can't tax you more than 50% of the market value. And that particular home was not worth very much. It wasn't worth the $5,000 that they were trying to charge me in taxes. So with that, I joined the coalition and started learning more and more about this injustice happening to myself and people around me. And in no way, shape, or form did I, for 1 second, not think, oh, this is happening because I'm Black and the majority of the homeowners or people in my city are Black. It really felt that way. It felt like any other situation where you're being judged by the color of your skin. And it's not a feeling that I can fully explain to you guys, but it was something that was familiar. It was something that I knew very well. And I knew that this was happening to myself and people like me because it was a predominantly Black city. And I say that because if this particular injustice was happening in, let's say, St. Clair Shores or one of the other rich suburbs in Michigan, at this rate, at the rate that it's happening in Detroit, there would have been this uproar because those particular people not only are educated more about property taxes and things of that nature, they just wouldn't have let it stand in their community. But in my community, people get that tax bill and we look at it, we see the number, and pretty much that's as far as we go. I owe this, now I have this stress, now I got to get my house paid off or I'm going to lose my house. A lot of us, number one, don't understand the bill to begin with. Don't understand terms like overassessment or assessed value or anything of that nature. We just get the bill, look at the bill. Now I owe this money. Now I have this pressure. So it became my personal goal to, number one, educate the community on what was happening to them, what an assessed value is, and why they were being overassessed, and why the city wanted to take their homes. So that's kind of been my mission since that phone call with Professor Atuahene, just to get out into the community, do whatever I could to right the wrong that the city was doing. But number one, start educating the poorer neighborhoods on what was happening to them. And when I say poorer neighborhoods, you know, people tend to get this view of like, you know, poverty level, or they might be on food stamps, or I'm talking about people who have 5th grade educations, people whom strictly live off of whatever government assistance they're getting, whether it's Social Security or they're getting some money through Department of Human Services every 2 weeks. People that not only don't know about these situations, but didn't really want to know. They didn't care. Oh, I heard so many times, oh, I owe the taxes, I'm gonna pay them, or I'm just gonna let the house go. They didn't even want to obtain that this could be being done to them illegally, because it's really hard to believe, right? Somebody comes to you and tells you, hey, I know you didn't pay your taxes, but you shouldn't have to pay your taxes because what they're doing is illegal, because the taxes they say you owe are inflated, or the taxes they say you owe, you don't owe because you're under the federal poverty line. It feels very personal. It's a very personal failure. So for someone to come to me like Professor Atuahene and say, this is being done to you versus you just didn't pay your bills, is hard to, you know, soak in. It's like, yeah, but I could have paid when I had this small amount of money or something like that. And that's just how it feels. It feels like a real personal failure, no matter what people say to you. The great thing about the coalition that I've noticed through the 4 or almost 5 years, however long it's been that we've been working, is people are starting to listen now. Versus in the beginning, again, people didn't want to hear it. It's like, no, I did this. Now people are starting to take notice just a little bit more because we've done so much hard work, number one, on educating the community. What Jerry was talking about, and a lot of the time what Professor Atuahene talks about, is the fighting we do behind the scenes, right? Gathering the data, fighting with the city, trying to get them to look at people as people and not just another number. But when you get out into the community and you really start talking to people and you do that enough for people to kind of remember you a little bit, then we have made some progress. Then we have stepped forward because now people are listening. So one of the grand things we did out of the coalition was start a program called the Dignity Restoration Housing Program. In that program, we came up with this magnificent idea to take homes that were on the auction block or just vacant to begin with, fix those homes up and give them to people who were illegally assessed and illegally foreclosed upon scot-free. And we were able to, so let me backtrack a bit. At the beginning of starting this program and getting into it, obtaining the houses, somebody bought the house I was living in. Somebody went to the auction, bought the home. I got an eviction notice. We went to court, made no difference, of course. I had 30 days to get out. And at this point, I was still unemployed, still doing very poorly financially. So I got the first Dignity house. I was director of the program, but it just so happened to align that I was being evicted and we had a house available. After that, we fixed up the next house and gave it to a woman with 3 children. And then the last house we gave away was to a Detroiter whose family had owned the home since 1920 or 19, something like that. Might have been 02, I can't remember, but a very long time.
1908.
1908. This house stayed in his family all this time, and he lost it to illegal foreclosure. And when we say illegal foreclosure, we're not just looking at people's houses and saying, you lost that house illegally. We're doing the research and going back and saying, we're looking at the property values in the neighborhood, looking at not just that, we're looking at if the house has an abandoned house next door, if there's a down school, you know, we're looking at the condition in the neighborhood, and then we're putting all that together and saying, no, he shouldn't be paying $20,000 a year in property taxes. So he lost his home that had been in his family all that time, and we were able to give him another home. That beautiful program was a blueprint for the city. So we could say this type of reparations or reparations period are possible. It is possible for you to right the wrongs you've done to these people. And here, look, we did it. This small coalition with no money, we fundraised, we did GoFundMe, we did everything possible to get up the money to fix these houses up on our own. And so we said, here, look, city, this is how you can fix what you've done. And of course, they, in every way possible that they could, said, well, that's impossible for us to do. Go. Sorry. So that was one of the most beautiful things born out of the coalition. And it was one of the most beautiful things because we were actually able to directly give to the community. And that felt amazing. But more than anything, it proved, if not to the city who barely listens, but to us, that it is possible for them to fix what they've done, not that they will. This was rolled into a compensation ordinance that was craftily put together by members of the coalition. And I don't know if it's been presented yet. I know we've definitely talked to the city about it a lot, and you know, they do what they always do, which is ignore us or try to pretend, kind of what Jerry was saying, there's no evil being done here. There's, you know, we're not doing anything wrong. When, you know, they clearly are. So I wanted to tell you about Dignity because, again, it was one of the most beautiful things born of the coalition. And it wasn't one of those behind the scene things where we're fighting the city or we're trying to draft up ordinances. This is one of the things where we got in the mud with the people and we're able to give directly back to them. And being the first recipient of a Dignity house felt amazing. It was right on time, but all it did was make me absolutely want to give out more houses. We were unable to do that any further because it is very expensive. And again, we were raising this money on our own. But I really am very, very hopeful that in the ordinance that was crafted, the city takes it on somehow. That's a hope. So from that, a great member coalition, well, not from Dignity, but a great member of the coalition named Amanda Alexander had this dream some years back to start this organization that helped returning citizens. And she did, and it's called the Detroit Justice Center. So she created a position, her and Professor Atuahene created a position called the Community Legal Workers, which was born from another organization called Namati. Namati sees and has trained your typical citizen in ways of the law to go out into the community and help people to navigate the law more easily. And so this is where the idea started. And then Professor Atuahene and Amanda Alexander created the position within the Detroit Justice Center. So myself and 2 other community legal workers, we work on housing there. What we do is we appeal property taxes at that time, at the time of year that you can appeal it in Detroit, which is a very, very short window. It is from February 1st to February 14th, and that's all. They give us this small amount of time to say, do comparable sales to prove, of course, that the home is overassessed. Get us that proof. You know, get your paperwork in order. Come down to the city county building. Well, at first things, you write an appeal and send it in to the city county building. Then in March, you present in front of the Board of Review in this very short window. So the first year we tried to get as many people as possible, helping them. We created a system in which to do that. And the first year we were able to help 40 people. It felt really good, but the number felt really small. We just couldn't wait until the next year to help more. This year we helped almost 80 people, which again, the number sounds small, but it's a huge amount of work. And it feels amazing. During that, the most amazing part about it is speaking and dealing with the community. Because I heard a phrase, I heard a quote one time that resonated with me, and it still does. And I make sure that I say it as much as possible. And that is, the people closest to the problem are the people closest to the solution. So while we're doing all this work and we're doing all the behind the scenes work and we're doing all the paperwork, the biggest thing I want you guys to grasp from this and walk away with is that you have to talk to and listen to the people that are in the shit. Because if you're not doing that, then you'll go nowhere. When we have these meetings and we have these conferences, they need to be at the table. They need to be able to tell you what's really going on, because you can empathize all you want, but until you've been in that position, you have no idea what it's like. So Professor Atuahene also started a clinic this year with some students that also did the property tax appeals. So together, I think we were able to do, I don't know, it's over 100, Bernadette, I can't remember the number, but it was much more than last year. And again, felt amazing. And of course, through the process, through going into the city county building, trying to get this great work done, they pushed back as many times as they could. They tried to push back on paperwork. They were terrible to us when we went in person, especially to the student, Professor Atuahene's students. But we got it done. We are looking at and trying to figure out other ways that we can help people going through this terrible process. I hadn't really heard the numbers or thought about anything until I heard Jerry speak earlier, but I had this feeling because of COVID, there are no foreclosures in 2020. Great, right? But I have this horrible rumbling that 2021 is going to be hell for the community. It's going to be hell for the community because they gave us 2020 with no foreclosures, but we are going to pay for that in 2021. I know that we are. So that makes this particular work that much more important, right? So that makes the coalition work and work at the Detroit Justice Center that much more important. We have to be diligent about what we're doing, because I feel like for the few years to come, especially starting with 2021, we're going to have a lot of work to do, which is sad, right? You should, with all the work we've done, with all the research, with all the community work, because Professor Atuahene had students that were canvassing, trying to get people enrolled in the Poverty Tax Exemption, which I mentioned earlier, which is just if you're a veteran, if you're disabled, or if you're making under the federal poverty line, then there's a great deal of a great chance that you don't have to pay taxes. But so many people in the city have no idea about it. You would think that this was something the city would promote, right? Like you see billboards on how to get on a payment plan to pay your taxes in Detroit, but no information about the poverty tax exemption. No information on the fact that you can appeal your assessment. No information on how to do that, right? So we are sure that the city still doesn't want the community to be educated because they think we're ignorant. So if we stay ignorant, they're able to continue the horrible work that they're doing. So I say that coming up this year, the rest of this year, 2021, we've got so much work to do. You know, we've got a lot of work to do. There is about to be a lot of families going through a really, really hard time because I really do feel like the city is about to hit us hard. So I don't know how many of you are actually thinking about getting into this work, you know, for the long haul, but I'll say this to you. Don't be afraid to reach out to the community. You know, don't be afraid to talk to people and ask them what's really going on. You're not going to get the real answers with just the numbers. You need to talk to the community. And secondly, pay attention to what's coming up. 2021, I really, again, really believe they're really going to try to do some damage in the poorest communities, which unfortunately is majority of Detroit. A few of the areas in Detroit look a little better, but that's because outsiders have moved in and they made it look better for them. They never cared enough to make it look better for us, the people that have actually stayed in this city and helped the city to be what it is, through its fall, through its comeback, all of that. Those of us that didn't leave. So yeah, that's all I want you to take away from it. The community should be forefront in your mind, and that when you drive down a Detroit street and you see that it's all tore up and you kind of shake your head at the condition, know that they did not do that to themselves. You can only believe one or two things. You believe people in these areas are ignorant and destructive and they did this to themselves, or you're looking at the real picture and you are saying this was structurally done. This was structurally done because they're poor and because they're Black. You can only believe two things. There's no middle ground there. So choose what you believe and then start fighting about it, because we need everybody in this fight. You're being educated about it, but what are you going to do after this?